Imagine this before anything else. A city of millions falls quiet by degrees, not all at once. The wealthier streets dim behind curtains, shop shutters close, taverns empty slowly. Hooves tap across wet stone. Somewhere far off, a bell counts an hour no one wants to name. And under the gas lamps, where the fog turns every face into half a secret, women are already waiting. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you will stop seeing them as background figures in a Victorian nightmare and start seeing them for what they really were. Workers of last resort in a city that condemned them publicly, used them privately, and almost never admitted how close many respectable lives stood to the same edge. It is London, 1888. A city so large, it feels less like one place than 1,000 separate worlds stitched together badly. At one end, grand houses glow behind velvet curtains. At the other, whole families crowd into damp rooms where air, privacy, and money are all in short supply. Between those two Londons moves a third one, quieter, harder to describe, and far more honest about what survival costs. That is the London you enter after dark. Not the city of monuments and empire, but the city of corners, doorways, cheap lodging houses, tavern exits, market lanes, and women standing still enough to avoid attention, but visible enough to be found. Most people who imagine prostitution in Victorian London imagine noise, calling out, aggression, a kind of theatrical vice designed for later novels and films. But the real thing was often quieter than that. Small signals. A glove adjusted. A shawl tightened. A step into the lamplight at the exact right moment. An exchange so brief it might last less than 15 seconds before both people vanish into a passage or yard and the street looks ordinary again. That is one of the first unsettling truths the city teaches you. The trade was not hidden because London failed to notice it. It was hidden because London had developed a whole culture of noticing without acknowledging. Walk east first, toward Whitechapel. The air changes before you even realize it. Fewer bright windows, more market carts, more laborers than gentlemen, more exhaustion hanging in the posture of the people you pass. Whitechapel at night is crowded and lonely at the same time. Men come back from the docks with bent shoulders. A constable passes with his lantern swinging in a slow arc. He sees the women near the corner. They see him. He keeps walking. Everyone involved understands the arrangement. Prostitution here was widespread enough to be part of the neighborhood's nightly rhythm, yet tolerated only as long as it remained sufficiently discreet, sufficiently poor, sufficiently easy for respectable society to treat as somebody else's problem. And this is where the story becomes more uncomfortable than scandal usually allows. Because most of these women did not arrive here as Victorian moralists preferred to imagine, through one grand collapse of virtue. That was the fantasy. The fallen woman, destroyed by some single moral error. But the records and social investigations point to something less dramatic and far more cruel. A lost domestic position, a missed week of wages, rent that could not be paid, a man who promised help and vanished. Migration from the countryside into a city that offered opportunity in theory and indifference in practice. Again and again, women seem to have drifted toward the street through smaller crises that stacked on top of one another until the last remaining option no longer felt like a choice at all. That matters because it changes what this world actually is. It is not a separate underworld populated by people born different from everyone else. It is part of the labor economy. For poor women in London, the legitimate work available could be brutal, unstable, and barely enough to survive on even when it existed. Domestic service gave food and a bed, but only until dismissal. Laundry destroyed the body and paid little. Factory work came and went. Sewing paid pennies. Miss enough work, and hunger arrived quickly. Miss rent, and the street arrived after that. Some women sold sex regularly. Others moved in and out of it seasonally or in emergencies, depending on whether other work could be found. In that sense, prostitution was not always an identity. Often it was the place where the rest of the economy sent women when everything else failed. And yet, London insisted on treating these women not as evidence of structural failure, but as symbols of individual disgrace. That is one of the city's deepest hypocrisies. By daylight, respectable families spoke of modesty, purity, and proper conduct. Public conversation about sex was so tightly wrapped in manners that even the furniture of the age sometimes became part of the performance of restraint. And yet, by night, men in respectable coats crossed into districts where everyone understood exactly what they were seeking. Etiquette manuals warned gentlemen not to acknowledge prostitutes openly. The law focused overwhelmingly on regulating the women involved, while the men buying their services remained far less visible in public condemnation and legal scrutiny. Victorian society did not solve the contradiction. It choreographed it. Now move west in your imagination. Covent Garden after midnight is not Whitechapel. The difference matters. The market quiets, the theatres empty. Men in evening clothes emerge, laughing into the damp air. Along the edges of that laughter stand women, waiting beneath lamps. Here the atmosphere can feel less brutal, more polished, more theatrical. But it belongs to the same hidden map. Soho adds another variation again. Cafes, immigrant neighborhoods, rented rooms, music, private arrangements less visible than the street trade of the East End. London's prostitution economy had layers, almost like another class system running parallel to the official one. Poorer women in Whitechapel worked quickly, cheaply, often near lodging houses or alleys. In areas like Covent Garden and Soho, some arrangements were slower, involved food, drink, boarding house rooms, and clients with more money to spend on the illusion that this was not simply another transaction in the same citywide economy of need. And above these layers stood the courtesans. Not the women under the worst lamps, but those moving in and out of the outer circles of elite society, where beauty, charm, education, and patronage could buy a much softer version of dependence. Some had apartments, gifts, jewelry, even tutors. Some learned languages, music, and social graces, because wit and presentation could be as valuable as appearance when wealthy men wanted not just a body, but a companion who could move through drawing rooms without embarrassing them. It looked glamorous from the outside, and sometimes by comparison to Whitechapel, it probably was. But glamour is only another costume if the stability beneath it still depends on men, luck, and time. Back in Whitechapel, though, the night is more practical. A woman waits beneath a lamp for hours. She watches the boots of men approaching. She learns to judge speed, posture, hesitation, drunkenness, risk. She calculates which customer might pay, which might refuse, which might turn violent, which constable is due to round the corner, which doorway is already in use, which pub has just closed and may spill business onto the pavement. This is why the work demanded more than endurance. It demanded reading people at speed, under pressure, in conditions where one mistake could cost far more than a few coins. Some nights the business was slow. Some nights it picked up after taverns emptied. Some women stayed out 10 or 12 hours because one more customer might mean bread tomorrow. That is not vice. That is arithmetic And if you have ever been in a position where survival forced you to measure morality against rent, hunger, or immediate need, leave a comment with a real example from your life. Not because the situations are identical, but because the emotional logic is. The moment when people outside your life imagine choice, while inside it, you are really only calculating damage. Now watch the police more closely. A constable appears. Women step into doorways, move along, pretend to examine shop fronts. He passes. They drift back out. This dance happened over and over because prostitution itself was not directly illegal, but the public spaces around it could be policed through vague charges like soliciting, loitering, obstruction, and disorder. That vagueness gave the state flexibility, and flexibility usually means pressure aimed downward. Arrests happened, fines happened, short prison stays happened, but so did quiet tolerance. Officials often seemed less interested in erasing prostitution than in keeping it from becoming too visible, too noisy, too embarrassing to deny. Even the policing, in other words, was part of the same performance. Control the appearance, not the cause. By the second half of the night, another truth begins to show itself. These women were not always as isolated as moral reformers preferred to imagine. They formed loose networks, shared warnings, shared information, shared tea, shared moments of laughter that sound almost impossible, until you remember that, even under hard conditions, human beings reach for companionship. Some women had preferred spots, preferred lodging houses, preferred allies. Some used nicknames to protect whatever remained of their private selves. Some even helped one another with childcare when there was no other solution. It was not a formal sisterhood. Poverty rarely allows anything so neat. But it was not pure isolation either. The street, cool as it was, also produced its own fragile forms of solidarity. In the next part, we go deeper into that hidden society, into the lodging houses where the night ended, into the fear of disease, the contagious diseases acts, the strange mix of medicine and humiliation, and into the final question Victorian London never truly answered. Not how to regulate these women, but why a city that needed them so badly found it easier to judge them than to change the conditions that made them necessary. And when the night finally begins to loosen its grip, the women do not go home in any comforting sense of the word. They disappear into common lodging houses, the cheapest form of shelter many can afford. For a few pennies, a bed, or sometimes only a place on the floor. Warmth, but not comfort. Company, but not privacy. Crowded benches, weak tea, damp clothes steaming near a small stove, iron bed frames upstairs, rough blankets, cracked windows left slightly open to fight the smell of too many bodies packed too close together. These places were harsh, unstable, and often miserable. Yet, they were also vital. Thousands of London's poorest relied on them, and for prostitutes, they were often the only barrier between one night's earnings and complete exposure to the street. Inside those houses, another version of the city appears. Not the one of sermons and editorials, but the one built from practical kindness. Women sharing tea, comparing notes on dangerous clients, warning each other about police routes, recommending safer streets, passing on rumors about who had vanished, who had been arrested, and which lodging housekeeper was less cruel than the others. In some cases, even arranging childcare through trusted friends when there was no other way to work and keep a child alive at the same time. These were not ideal communities. Poverty rarely allows ideal anything. But they were real communities. Loose networks of advice, caution, and companionship that made survival slightly less lonely than Victorian moralists preferred to imagine. Some women even protected themselves through aliases, using nicknames to keep at least a thin wall between their street life and whatever remained of their private selves. And over all of this hung the fear of disease. Not abstract fear, but the kind that haunted policy, medicine, newspapers, and military reports. Victorian doctors knew enough about syphilis and gonorrhea to be frightened, but not enough to understand them cleanly or cure them effectively. Soldiers and sailors filled hospitals with cases. Chemists sold secret remedies, herbal mixtures, diluted mercury, bottled hope disguised as medicine. Parliament responded with the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed women suspected of prostitution in certain towns to be detained and subjected to invasive medical examinations. That choice tells you almost everything about the age. Public health anxiety was real, but so was the reflex to treat women's bodies as the site of control, while the men who bought sex remained far less visible in law and blame. Even among historians, the debate has never fully settled. Were these laws flawed attempts to manage a genuine health crisis, or were they mainly another way of disciplining female sexuality under the cover of science? The answer, like so much in this story, is tangled. And that is why this story matters so much. Because once you strip away the melodrama, what remains is not a tale of wickedness lurking in the fog. It is a story about labor, hunger, housing, migration, illness, law, and the extraordinary human ability to keep functioning inside systems that refuse to protect you. Victorian London called these women fallen, but that word hides more than it reveals. It suggests they dropped from some secure moral height, when in reality, many had never been given firm ground to stand on at all. They were judged as symbols while living as consequences. Consequences of wages too low, rent too high, service too precarious, medicine too expensive, and a culture more committed to preserving appearances than to confronting what its own economy was doing to the people at the bottom of it. If this kind of reconstruction makes the past feel more human, more uncomfortable, and more real, subscribe to the channel now and share this video with one genuinely close, like-minded friend who cares about history not as decoration, but as a way of understanding how societies hide their deepest truths in plain sight. Because in the end, the women under the gas lamps were not outside Victorian London. They were one of its clearest reflections. A city that praised purity, that relied on secrecy. A legal system that regulated women more than men. A moral culture that loved condemnation more than honesty. A labor market that offered women just enough respectable options to blame them when those options failed. And through all of it, beneath the fog, past the patrols, through the long hours of standing and waiting and calculating one more night's survival, these women kept doing something that history too often forgets to admire properly. They endured. Not theatrically, not romantically, just stubbornly, intelligently, and at great cost. So when morning finally bleaches the fog into grey light and the city begins pretending again, remember this. The real story of prostitutes in London in 1888 is not simply the story of vice. It is the story of a civilization revealing itself most honestly after dark. And once you have walked those streets in your imagination, it becomes much harder to believe that the women standing beneath those lamps were the shame of the city. More often, they were the evidence against it.